So, here's the thing, my parents stole my wedding money. Yep, you read that right. The money they'd been saving for my special day, gone. And the kicker? They used it to throw my twin sister, Laura, the most extravagant, Instagram-worthy wedding you could imagine. Let me back up a little. I'm Natalie, 28, and Laura is my identical twin. Growing up, everyone thought it was so cute how we were opposites. Laura's the golden girl, bubbly, charming, and the type to walk into a room and have everyone's attention. Me? I'm the quieter, more introverted one. I don't mind being in the background, but that doesn't mean I don't notice things. And let me tell you, the favoritism started early anyway. Back to the money. My parents had always said they were saving for both of our weddings. They weren't exactly rich, but they prided themselves on setting up a wedding fund for us. They'd been talking about it for years, how they wanted both their daughters to have their dream weddings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a nice venue, a decent dress, and a small but beautiful ceremony. Fast forward to last year. Laura gets engaged to her boyfriend, Eric, and the whole family's ecstatic. And don't get me wrong, I was happy for her too. But something fell off. It started with little things, like Mom saying they might need to dip into my share of the fund because Laura's dream venue was a bit over budget. Then it was, oh, the caterer's more expensive than we thought. We'll make it up later. You can probably guess how this went. By the time her wedding rolled around, it was a full-blown production. We are talking chandeliers, a custom designer dress, a live band flown in from another city, the works. Meanwhile, I'm standing there in a bridesmaid dress I paid for myself, clapping along like everything's fine. But inside, I'm seething. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was no money left for me. My parents spent everything on Laura. I tried to bring it up once, gently, a few months after the wedding. Hey, so, about the wedding fund, I said to Mom. She gave me that tight-lipped smile she always does when she's about to dismiss me. Oh, honey, don't worry about that. We'll figure something out when your time comes. But here's the thing, my boyfriend, Mark, and I had already been talking about getting engaged. I knew my time wasn't some distant, far-off thing. I tried to push back, but Mom shut me down. Laura's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, she said, as if I didn't deserve the same. And when I mentioned how unfair it felt, she had the audacity to say, well, Natalie, you're just not as a high maintenance as Laura. I'm sure you'll be happy with something simpler. Simpler. That word haunted me for weeks. Sure enough, when Mark proposed a few months later, I knew I was on my own. My parents didn't even pretend to help. They'd spent so much on Laura's wedding that they were tapped out. I remember Mom's exact words when I asked if there was anything left. Sweetheart, maybe you and Mark could do something small. Like a courthouse wedding. Those can be so romantic. I was furious, but here's the thing, I didn't tell them I was mad. I just stopped cooperating. I stopped answering their calls as often, stopped showing up to family dinners. When they asked how wedding planning was going, I gave them vague, polite answers. I didn't want their help at that point. I didn't trust them. Mark and I decided to have a small, intimate wedding, paid for with our own savings. It wasn't what I dreamed of, but it was ours. Laura, of course, had no idea what was going on. She's not malicious, but she's clueless. You're so lucky you don't have to deal with the stress of planning a big wedding, she told me once, completely oblivious. I bit my tongue so hard it nearly bled. For a while, things were fine. I kept my distance and my parents seemed happy enough to focus on Laura and Eric's perfect married life. But then, a year after my wedding, everything changed. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my dad. Now, you have to understand, Dad's not the emotional type. He's the suck it up and move on kind of guy. So when he called me sounding frantic, I knew something was seriously wrong. Nat, he said, his voice shaky. We need your help. And just like that, the careful distance I'd put between us started crumbling. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, gripping my phone so hard I thought I might crack the screen. What do you mean, you need my help? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad sighed, a long, heavy exhale that only made me more anxious. It's complicated. Your mom and I, we are in a bit of a bind. Financially. Oh, the irony. I almost laughed. These were the same people who'd blown every dime on Laura's wedding, leaving me high and dry. And now they were asking me for help. What kind of a bind? I pressed, crossing my arms. It's the house, Dad said after a long pause. We are behind on the mortgage. Way behind. And the bank's threatening foreclosure. That stopped me in my tracks. Foreclosure? How did it get that bad? Dad hesitated, and then Mom's voice came through in the background, muffled but frantic. Just tell her, Jim. She's going to find out anyway. Turns out, after Laura's wedding, my parents had taken out a second mortgage to cover the remaining costs. Then, instead of tightening their belts, they'd kept spending like nothing was wrong. Lavish vacations. New furniture. Hosting fancy dinner parties to show off how well they were doing. All while their debt snowballed in the background, and now they were drowning. Look, Natalie, Dad said, his tone shifting to something almost pleading. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. You and Mark are doing well, aren't you? If you could just loan us some money, loan. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. How much are we talking about? There was another pause, and then Mom got on the phone. We are behind about 30 grand, she said, like it was no big deal. But anything you could contribute would help. I nearly dropped the phone. $30,000. That was more than Mark and I had spent on our entire wedding. I didn't even know what to say. Mom, we don't have that kind of money lying around. Surely you can figure something out, she said, her voice dripping with that passive-aggressive tone she always used when she didn't get her way. What about Mark's family? They are well off, aren't they? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had the nerve to ask for help after everything they'd done. After they'd made it abundantly clear that Laura's happiness was more important than mine. I'll think about it, I said finally, just to get them off the phone. But the second I hung up, I knew my answer was no. There was no way I was bailing them out of a mess they'd created themselves. When I told Mark what happened, he was just as furious as I was. Let me get this straight, he said, pacing our living room. They spent all their money on Laura's wedding, didn't help you with yours, and now they want us to fix their mistakes. Pretty much, I said, sinking into the couch. They even suggested I ask your parents for help. Mark let out a bitter laugh. That's not happening. For a few days, I ignored their calls. I needed time to think, to figure out how to handle this without completely losing my mind. But they weren't about to let me off the hook that easily. A few days later, Laura showed up at my door. Hey, stranger, she said brightly, holding a bottle of wine. Mind if I come in? I was immediately suspicious. Laura never just dropped by unannounced, especially with wine. She was up to something. But I stepped aside and let her in, because, well, she's my sister. We sat down in the living room, and she started rambling about some new workout class she and Eric were trying. I waited, sipping my coffee, knowing she'd get to the point eventually. Sure enough, after about 10 minutes, she set down her glass and looked at me with her best concerned sister face. So, Mom and Dad told me what's going on, she said, her voice soft. They are really in a tough spot, National. I think we should help them. I almost choked on my coffee. We? Laura, I don't know about you, but I don't have 30 grand lying around. She waved a hand dismissively. I'm not saying we cover the whole thing. But, maybe we could each chip in a little. Every bit helps. Chip in. I repeated, my voice rising. Laura, they spent everything on your wedding. You don't think they should have thought about the mortgage before they booked a live band and a private fireworks show? Laura frowned, like she hadn't considered that. It's not like I asked for all that, she said defensively. I didn't know they were going into debt. Did you even think to ask? I shot back. You're their favorite, Laura. They've always bent over backward for you, and now they expect me to clean up the mess. That's not fair, she said, crossing her arms. They love both of us. I laughed bitterly. Yeah, sure. That's why they spent my wedding money on you. The room went silent. Laura stared at me, her mouth slightly open. Wait, what? I blinked, realizing I just said the quiet part out loud. You didn't know? I asked, my voice softer now. No, she said, shaking her head. They never told me that. For the first time, I saw something like guilt flicker across her face. Nat, I didn't know. If I had, I would have said something. I swear. I wanted to believe her, but I wasn't sure I could. Still, part of me felt a little vindicated. At least now she knew the truth, but that didn't change the fact that my parents were still expecting me to save them. And I had no idea what to do next. After Laura left, I sat in the living room for what felt like hours, staring at the wall. My emotions were all over the place. Anger, frustration, and, weirdly enough, guilt. Not because I felt bad for my parents, but because part of me wondered if I was being too cold. They were still my parents, after all, and the thought of them losing their house was hard to stomach, but then I'd think about how they treated me. How they'd made me feel like an afterthought my whole life, especially when it came to the wedding. And I'd get mad all over again. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of texts from my mom. Mom, we really need to talk, Natalie. Please call me. Mom, I don't understand why you're being so distant. We are a family. Mom, Laura said she talked to you. She said you seemed upset. Can we please work this out? I ignored them and went about my day. Mark and I had already decided we weren't giving them any money, and honestly, I didn't feel like rehashing the same argument over and over, but then Laura called. Nat, hey, she said, sounding hesitant. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About the wedding money. Yeah. I said cautiously. I talked to Mom and Dad about it, she continued. And they admitted it. They said they used your share for my wedding. Hearing her say it out loud made my stomach churn, even though I already knew the truth. What did they say about it? I asked. Laura hesitated. They said they didn't think you'd mind. That you'd want me to have the wedding I dreamed of. And, well, that you've always been a more practical. I snorted. Right. Because being practical means I don't deserve the same things as you. I didn't say that, she said quickly. Look, I get why you're upset. I do. And I know it's not fair. That's why. I want to help. That caught me off guard. Help? How? I talked to Eric, she said. We don't have a ton of extra cash right now, but we can chip in $5,000. It's not much, but it's something. I blinked, stunned. Laura offering to help financially was the last thing I'd expected. That's generous, I said carefully. But Laura, why should we bail them out? They made their bed, you know. I know, she said, sighing. But they are still our parents. And I don't want them to lose the house. Can you imagine how humiliating that would be for them? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Laura, it's not just about the house. It's about the way they've treated us, treated me. They never even asked how I felt about them using my money. They just assumed I'd be fine with it. And now they are coming to me like nothing ever happened, asking me to save them. It's insulting. I get that, she said quietly. I really do. But I also think holding on to all this anger isn't going to help anyone. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I even knew how to respond to that. The next weekend, I finally caved and went to see my parents. Not because I wanted to help them, but because I felt like I needed to say my piece face to face. When I walked into their house, it felt different. The place I'd grown up in suddenly felt smaller, almost suffocating. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch, looking anxious. They both stood up when they saw me. Natalie, Mom said, her voice trembling. Thank you for coming. We've been so worried about you. I crossed my arms. I'm fine. But I think we need to talk. Dad gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing. Look, I said, cutting to the chase. I understand that you're in a tough spot. But I can't help you. I don't have the money, and even if I did, I don't think I'd give it to you. Mom's face crumpled. Natalie, please. Don't say that. We wouldn't ask if we didn't need it. The bank is going to take the house, and whose fault is that? I interrupted. You didn't need to spend every penny on Laura's wedding. You didn't need to take out a second mortgage. But you did. And now you're asking me to fix it. Dad's face hardened. We were trying to give you girls the best. Everything we did for the family. No, I said firmly. Everything you did for Laura. You've been favoring her my whole life, and this is just the latest example. You don't even see how unfair it is, do you? Mom started crying, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I felt like I'd spent my entire life trying to appease them, to earn their approval, and I was done. We're sorry, Mom said through her tears. We didn't mean to make you feel that way. We thought you'd understand. Well, I don't, I said. And I won't be bailing you out. With that, I turned and left. I could hear Mom sobbing as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. For the next few weeks, the silence was deafening. No calls, no texts. Even Laura stopped reaching out. I thought maybe that was it, that I'd finally drawn the line and they'd given up, but then, just as I was starting to relax, I got a text from an unknown number. Unknown, Natalie, this is Eric. Please call me. It's about your parents. Something about the message made my stomach sink. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew it wasn't good. When I saw Eric's name pop up on my phone, my first instinct was to ignore it. I just started to feel like I had some distance from all the drama, and the last thing I wanted was to get dragged back into it. But the way the text was worded, "It's about your parents," set off alarms in my head. I stared at the message for a few minutes, debating whether to call him back. Finally, curiosity, and maybe a little guilt, got the better of me. Eric, I said when he picked up. Hey, Natalie, he said, sounding unusually serious. Thanks for calling. Look, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know your dad had a heart attack last night. For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. What? I finally managed to say. He's stable now, Eric said quickly, as if to soften the blow. He's in the hospital. The doctors said it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was a wake-up call. Your mom's a wreck, and honestly, I don't think she's handling things very well. Laura asked me to reach out because, well, we thought you'd want to know. I felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, guilt, anger. I just had that awful confrontation with them, and now this. It felt almost cosmic, like some twisted test of my resolve. Thanks for letting me know, I said stiffly. I'll think about what to do. Nat, Eric said before I could hang up, I know things are strained between you and your parents. But this isn't about the money or the house anymore. Your dad's health is at stake. I didn't respond, just muttered a quick goodbye and ended the call. Mark found me sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. What happened? He asked, sitting next to me. My dad had a heart attack, I said flatly. Mark's face softened. Oh, national. I'm sorry. Is he okay? Apparently, I said. He's stable. But Eric called because Laura thinks I should go see him. You know, put everything aside for the sake of the family or whatever. Mark hesitated. Do you want to go? I don't know, I admitted. Part of me feels like I should, but the other part. I don't know if I can face them right now. Mark put a hand on my knee. You don't have to decide right this second. Take some time to think about it. But I didn't need time. Deep down, I knew I'd end up going. No matter how angry I was, no matter how unfairly they treated me, they were still my parents. And the thought of my dad lying in a hospital bed, possibly thinking I didn't care, was too much to bear. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. As I walked down the hallway to my dad's room, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. When I stepped inside, the first thing I saw was my mom sitting by the bed, holding Dad's hand. She looked up and saw me, her eyes red and swollen. Natalie, she whispered, her voice trembling. Dad was pale, hooked up to monitors that beeped softly in the background. He looked smaller somehow, like the fight had gone out of him. Hi, Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave me a weak smile. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice hoarse. It hit me all at once, the fragility of the moment, the realization that my parents weren't invincible. For all their flaws, they were human. And they were scared. I pulled up a chair and sat down, unsure of what to say. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, my mom broke the silence. We didn't mean for things to get so bad, she said, her voice shaking. We just wanted to give you girls the best. And we made mistakes. Big ones. But, Natalie, we love you. I hope you know that. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that love wasn't enough to excuse the way they treated me. But sitting there, watching my dad struggle to even sit up, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Not yet. But I'm here now. That has to be enough for now. Mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. Dad reached for my hand, his grip weak but steady. We'll fix this, Nat, he said. I promise. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Over the next few days, I spent a lot of time at the hospital. Laura and I actually started talking again, though it was mostly small talk. She apologized again for not knowing about the wedding money, and I could tell she was genuinely trying to make amends, but things with my parents were more complicated. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope, trying to balance my anger with my desire to move forward. When Dad was finally discharged, we had a family meeting at their house to discuss their financial situation. It was worse than I'd imagined. The mortgage wasn't the only issue. They had credit card debt, medical bills, and barely any savings. We are going to lose the house, aren't we? Mum said, her voice breaking. I looked at Mark, who'd come with me for support. He gave me a small nod, silently telling me it was my call. I can't give you money, I said carefully. But I can help you figure out a plan. You'll need to downsize, maybe sell the house and move somewhere more affordable. It's not going to be easy, but it's doable. Mom started to protest, but Dad cut her off. She's right, honey. We can't keep living like this. It wasn't the resolution they'd hoped for, but it was the only one I could live with. That night, as Mark and I drove home, I felt an odd sense of peace. Things weren't perfect, not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my own story, and maybe, just maybe, my parents were finally starting to learn theirs. I wish I could say that after that family meeting, everything magically fell into place. But life doesn't work that way, and my parents didn't suddenly transform into perfect people. Old habits die hard, and their road to change was bumpy, to say the least. Selling the house was the first step. It was harder on Mum than anyone else. She cried the day the realtor put the for sale sign in the yard, walking from room to room like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. I could tell Dad was trying to be strong for her, but even he seemed shaken. This was the house where they'd raised Laura and me, where they'd hosted countless dinners and celebrations. Letting go of it was more than just a financial move. It was the end of an era, but the alternative was losing the house to foreclosure, and I think they finally understood that. Once the house sold, they moved into a much smaller apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was affordable, and for the first time in years, they weren't drowning in debt. I'll admit, part of me felt a little vindicated watching them downsize. After all, they'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. But another part of me, the part that still cared, despite everything, felt a pang of sympathy. They were trying. I could see that. And as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I knew I couldn't live my life that way. As for Laura, our relationship was complicated. She and Eric started helping my parents out in small ways, covering groceries here, helping with bills there. She said it was her way of making up for the wedding money, and while I appreciated the sentiment, it didn't erase the years of favoritism that had driven a wedge between us. Still, I found myself softening toward her. She wasn't the villain I'd made her out to be in my head. Clueless? Absolutely. But I started to see that she'd been just as caught up in our parents' dysfunction as I had. Maybe not in the same way, but still. She wasn't the one who'd decided to blow through my wedding fund. One afternoon, she came over with coffee and a peace offering, a photo album of my wedding. I was going through my pictures the other day, she said, handing it to me. And I realized I'd never made one of these for you. I know it's late, but I thought you'd like it. I opened the album, and there it was, my small, intimate wedding, captured in all its imperfect glory. Pictures of Mark and me laughing, our closest friends and family gathered around us, the simple backyard setup that we'd pulled together on a shoestring budget. It's beautiful, I said, my voice thick. Laura smiled. You deserved a lot more than that, National. I'm sorry. For the first time in a long time, I felt like she really meant it. Months passed, and slowly but surely, things started to feel okay. Not perfect, but okay. My parents learned how to live within their means. Laura and I started rebuilding our relationship, and I even found myself stopping by my parents' apartment for dinner once in a while. One night, over a surprisingly decent meal Mom had whipped up, Dad brought up something that caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about the way we handled things," he said, his voice low. "Especially with you, Natalie. We took you for granted, and we didn't treat you the way you deserved. I want you to know I'm sorry." I looked at him, surprised. "Dad wasn't the type to apologize, ever." "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "But it's going to take time." "I know," he said, nodding. "And I'm willing to wait." As for Mark and me, we started focusing on our own future. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could actually think about what I wanted instead of constantly managing my family's drama. We started saving for a house, something that was ours, not tied to anyone else's mistakes or expectations. One night, as we sat on the couch, I told Mark about the conversation with my dad. "Do you think they'll ever really change?" she asked. Mark shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But what matters is that you changed. You stood up for yourself. And that's not nothing." He was right. I couldn't control my parents, or their past choices, or even how they treated Laura and me. But I could control how I responded. I could set boundaries, speak my mind, and stop bending over backward to make everyone else happy. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was more than just the other twin. I was Natalie, stronger, wiser, and finally ready to write my own story, and that felt like the real happy ending.